The first type of macromolecule we're going to talk about are carbohydrates. And if you're a nutrition major or you're just interested in being healthy or why we're supposed to or not supposed to eat certain foods, you might be interested in this lecture. But I think everybody's heard of carbohydrates or carbs. But you may not have known specifically what they are, and you're going to learn probably more than you're interested in today. But carbohydrates include sugars and the polymers of sugars. Okay, so there's three main types of carbohydrates I want you to be familiar with. And there's monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. And they sound like big fancy names, but they're really pretty simple once you break them down. So let's start with monosaccharides. Well, if you break that word apart, mono actually means single, okay, or one. And then that word saccharide means sugar. So if you break it apart, monosaccharide or monosaccharide, you can conclude from that you only have one sugar. So it's a simple sugar. Now let's go to disaccharide and let's break that word apart. Well, di means two. We know that saccharide means sugar. So if we have a disaccharide, that means we're going to have a double sugar. Or we're going to have a polymer that's made up of two monosaccharides. And again, because we're talking about macromolecules, we know that those two monosaccharides that make up our disaccharide was kind of put together because of that condensation reaction we talked about, or that dehydration reaction, where we lost a water molecule. Now finally, people can refer to carbohydrates as polysaccharides. And poly means many, so we can conclude that if we have a polysaccharide, we're going to have a polymer that's composed of many sugar. So this is just an illustration of different types of carbohydrates you might come across. And you can see that the orange row on top is labeled as being an aldose. And on the bottom, we have a row that's labeled as being a ketose. And you can see that that's because of where that placement of that carbon that's double bonded to the oxygen is placed on the molecule. So if you have an aldose, that means that you have a carbon double bonded to an oxygen on the top of our molecule, whereas in the ketoses, it's usually located more along the lines of the middle of the molecule. This slide is just illustrating monosaccharides and the fact that they can take on two different shapes. You can get these linear monosaccharides, which they just look like kind of a straight line of carbons that are surrounded by these hydroxide groups. And you can also get monosaccharides that form these linear kind of ring-like structures. Now disaccharides, just to remind you, are made up of two monosaccharides. And we said that they are joined, or when we have two monomers coming together, they're joined because of those dehydration reactions. But if we're specifically talking about carbohydrates, they like to give them kind of their own name, of course, just so we have to memorize more stuff. But if we're specifically talking about a carbohydrate, the linkages that form between those monosaccharides are called glycosidic linkages. And looking down on the bottom of the page, you can see that there's just two examples of disaccharides. So the first one they're showing you is maltose. And you might not be that familiar with maltose, but you really are. So if you go to like a 50s diner and you get a malt, okay, that malt was made because of this disaccharide. If you go could get a beer or a whiskey or something like that, that's also available to us because of maltose. And then I think the more familiar disaccharide is sucrose. And sucrose is just table sugar that's joined because of a glucose and a fructose that have come together to create this disaccharide that we call sugar. And this is just illustrating that previous slide. So when you have two glucoses come together, two monosaccharides that come together, they create a disaccharide, and we call that maltose. On the bottom, when we get a glucose and a fructose that come together, we create a disaccharide that we call sucrose. Now again, polysaccharides are polymers with maybe a few hundred to a few thousand monosaccharides that are joined by glycosidic linkages. And they serve as storage material often to provide sugar for different types of cells. So we've all heard of starch. Well, starch is just basically a storage material for plants. And then if you're referring to carbohydrates that can be stored in animals, we refer to that as glycogen. Well, different types of polysaccharides are also used as kind of a building material. One that I want you to be familiar with is called cellulose. And cellulose is it's actually the most abundant organic molecule in the world, and we find that in plants. And then another example is chitin. So we find chitin in different types of arthropods. This picture is illustrating a starch molecule and a glycogen molecule. Again, they serve as kind of food storage in plants and animals. And then this is just another illustration for you. Cellulose. Again, cellulose is that building material. Okay, it's that building polysaccharide that we find in plants. And again, great extra credit question. This is the most abundant organic molecule in the world. Another thing, I think that everybody tells you you have to have enough cellulose. Well, we can't actually digest cellulose. We use it more as a fiber source, but you can find a lot of cellulose digesting bacteria and things like cows, and so that's an example of why you hear a lot about cellulose. And again, chitin is that building material we find in insects, and if you go out and you see cicadas on your trees or cicada exoskeletons on your trees, that's composed of chitin. And chitin's also kind of neat because they've been able to make different types of surgical threads or sutures out of this material.